going on YouTube? This your boy Juice Baby back in your chest again with another reaction video. You already know what time it is. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. Let me know what time it is. All right, we back at y'all. You know what I'm saying? Look, cops went crazy and killed everybody in the jail. Oh, we in the prisons. It's going crazy, man. It's going crazy. We finna see what this thing be about. We finna get right into it.
Balance of power suddenly shifts, and some of the deadliest criminals are now in charge. This horrifying spectacle has been happening in US prisons for hundreds of years, and there are some that continue to haunt the areas that surround them. These are the 10 bloodiest riots in US prisons. 10. United States Penitentiary, Florence High, April 20th, is the birthday of Adolf Hitler, and in 2008 a white supremacist prison gang used this occasion to mock the African-American inmates at United States Penitentiary, Florence High. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the white supremacist group began delivering racial slurs at the black inmates, and understandably, they got quite a violent response. They were drinking hooch, a form of homemade wine, and were clearly trying to egg other inmates into fighting them. While racially abusing these inmates, they were already carrying rocks they could use in self-defense. These racists got the response they were looking for, and a violent brawl ensued. This took place between 200 inmates and was incredibly difficult for the guards to keep under control. However, prison guards were on top of towers which overlooked the brawl. Initially, they fired what they called no-man shots, where they shot into the air, and hopefully, upon hearing the gunfire, the prisoners would cease what they were doing. These shots had little or no effect, and the riots continued. For certain inmates, they were given repeated orders that they refused to follow. So 2 inmates were shot dead by the police on that day. The riots have been looked back upon with suspicion. The mother of one of the inmates claims that her son was not a white supremacist and argues that many prisoners are forced to adopt these beliefs through fear and intimidation. She said, "He is not a white supremacist, but I don't know what happens in prison. From what I hear, when you are in high security, you are friends with whoever you have to be friends with to survive." She also wanted to know why her son specifically was shot. Apart from the 2 inmates who were killed, 5 others were merely injured. These prisoners were shot in the feet, whereas her son was shot in the chest. She told the Denver Post, "I think they want the public to believe it was justified, but I don't see how it justifies a killing. Why not shoot them in the leg?" And the plot thickens. Her son was white, whereas the other was black. To this, she responded, "It almost seems to me they were trying to send a message to those gangs in there. They took out 1 black and 1 white. 9. Montana State Prison. "This is a riot, and if you want to live, Cap, do what I say." These are the words of Jerry Miles, the instigator of a brutal riot in Montana State Prison in 1959. Prior to the riots, Miles was already a powerful figure in the prison and had been dubbed Little Hitler. He became friends with inmates, Lee Smart and George Alton, an inmate who could get him access to gasoline. Alton had smuggled gasoline from the garage and eventually had a lot of this fuel hidden inside a container in a cell. At 3:30 p.m. on the 16th of April 1959, a guard named Gus Byers was on patrol at cell block 1. He turned to open a window when he heard somebody shout his name. Inmate Lee Smart tossed gasoline all over him. Confused by this behavior, he then saw inmate Jerry Miles holding a match. They had poured gasoline in a circle around Byers and lit a ring of fire around him. The guard then surrendered his keys and rifle. The only other 2 guards in the cell block were also suddenly abused by inmates with knives. They soon broke into cell block 2, where all of the ammunition was held. By 4 p.m., this gang now had control of the majority of the entire prison. Little Hitler was now chancellor of the entire penitentiary. They were so quiet that the deputy warden was blissfully unaware at the time, and Miles ran into his office with a meat cleaver. Other guards who were also in his office managed to restrain Miles, but Lee Cox barged into the office and shot the warden in cold blood. Officer Simonson alerted the warden that a disturbance was underway and told the warden to come to a specific room. When he arrived inside that room, he realized that it was a trap, and Simonson was being forced to say his words from earlier. Miles and Smart now kept the warden as hostage and decided to phone the governor. The governor was away at the time, so they waited and waited for his response. The warden was under the watch of an inmate named Walter Trocchi, as well as other prisoners. However, the warden told his captors that if they released him, they would be given full amnesty for this riot. So the warden's suite talked the prisoners holding him hostage and managed to escape. With the warden gone, it was unlikely that the governor was going to return their call. In fact, the governor released a statement saying, "I am standing firm on my original statement that I have no intention to go to Deer Lodge or to talk to any of the rebellious convicts until order has been restored, all hostages released unharmed and convicts back in their cells. Getting increasingly anxious, the prisoners tried to dig a tunnel out, which would allow them to escape, but their time was desperately running out. And on the outside, the authorities used bazookas from World War II to shoot at them, which completely caught them off guard. 36 hours after Gus Byers had been surprisingly splashed with gasoline, the riot had come to an end. All of the hostages were unharmed. The only victims of this riot were Jerry Miles and Lee Smart, who had killed themselves before they were caught. Like his namesake, Little Hitler had committed suicide instead of facing the repercussions. West Virginia Penitentiary riot. You quit treating us like dogs and this wouldn't happen. We want better living conditions, better facilities, and better medical conditions. We don't want this any more than you do. These were the words of an inmate during the most infamous incident at the West Virginia Penitentiary. In this prison, conditions were inhumane. There were raw sewage flowing from pipes, rats in the cells, and maggots in food. It was New Year's Day, and a bug must have been going around as 16 prison officers called in sick, leaving the afternoon to evening shift incredibly under-resourced. So during their New Year's dinner, prisoners took their kitchen knives and overpowered the remaining 31 officers. The knife wielders led the charge, but soon 200 of the 750 inmates inside were violently taking control of the prison. They took 14 hostages in total and demanded to meet the governor. Danny Lehman, the then leader of the Avengers prison gang, led the charge. He was now the unofficial prison warden. Soon, the maximum security prison was surrounded by state troopers in riot gear. The only thing the prisoners had holding them back now were the threats to the lives of these poor hostages. One prison officer who was experiencing heart trouble was freed, but the prisoners were not so kind to their fellow inmates. A prisoner named Kent Sly had an existing grudge with another inmate and was killed. Another inmate named Robert Dayer was severely beaten and thrown off the 3rd floor of the unit with a telephone wire around his neck. Jeff Atkinson, who was in jail for murdering a pregnant woman, was given a taste of his own medicine. He was stabbed to death with a screwdriver. While killing Atkinson, they reportedly took out his heart. A reporter spoke to a hostage prisoner guard who witnessed this. He saw blood all over. Then he heard one guy say, "It's amazing how this little thing will keep a fellow alive." Then another one said, "Well, it won't keep him alive anymore." The inmates wanted to get some media attention and let the public know how they were treated. They demanded decent meals and at least one hot meal a day. More specifically, they demanded better medical services, better living quarters, a pizza, and some women. So, an agreement was signed between the prisoners and the prison. The prisoners also demanded that this was signed on live television, so they could not simply backtrack or later lie on what the terms were. 6 hostages were released later that afternoon as part of this agreement. After 48 hours, all of the hostages were eventually freed. Thankfully, they remained unharmed, but the 3 inmates who were killed were not so fortunate. 7. Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In the 1970s, Oklahoma State Penitentiary had 2 of the key ingredients that led to a prison riot. Their cells were overcrowded and their staff were not adequately trained. As well as these conditions, the governor had a particularly controversial stance on drug offenders. They were not allowed parole under any circumstances. Ed Hardy, one of Governor David Hall's aides, told the New York Times, when he was running for governor in 1970, he said he would not allow paroles for drug pushers, and he has not. The inmates know he means what he says. This was a controversial move both inside and outside the prison, with many people feeling that this was a breach of the prisoners' civil liberties. This cocktail of bad conditions in this prison eventually had its breaking point. On July 27, 1973, at 2:30 p.m., inmates in the hall stabbed 2 prison officers in the dining hall, leaving them critically injured. 2 other officers intervened but were overpowered and taken as hostages. Lionel Johnson, a cook working at the prison at the time, recalls, "I didn't know what was going on. I looked out the door and everyone was running every which way." Johnson was held hostage, but this was more to do with protecting him from the other inmates. Through his time working in the kitchen, he was friendly with some inmates, and they didn't want him getting caught in the crossfire. They ironically kept him hostage because they liked him. It wasn't really holding hostage, it was just a safe place to be. They, the inmates, saved us. By 4:30 p.m., inmate L. Woodrow Lee Brooks was beaten to death by other prisoners. By 5:35 p.m., the prison's hospital was taken over, and sections of the prison were now ablaze. The prisoners made demands to make them stop. They asked for a complete amnesty of convictions against the riot's ringleaders, as well as media coverage and access to human rights lawyers. After a day of rioting, they released the hostages. However, these prisoners still managed to keep hold of the prison for another 2 days. $20 million worth of damage was done to 24 buildings, but far more importantly, 21 inmates were injured and 3 sadly died. Although he lived to survive the riot, things were not easy for prison officer John Barrier. Decades on from being beaten, he has suffered seizures and strokes and has simply never been the same again. His wife Dolly, who has taken on the role of his carer since since said, "We never had no life." In the aftermath, the prison decided to scale down the number of inmates held inside and provide higher salaries and better training for the guards. This decision was later reversed, and the prison just went back to the highly impractical conditions it had beforehand. However, it was found that some of the conditions were in violation of the US Constitution, so some reforms were made. 6. Missouri State Penitentiary. In 1954, a deadly riot took place in Missouri State Penitentiary. Joseph Vidauri was one of the inmates at this time.
Kick it off because almost all the prisoners throughout the entire prison system was very unhappy about the brutality and about the food and about the lack of medication attention there for quite some time.
Another source claims rats and other vermin crawled around the solitary unit. An occasional snake crawled up through the piping and dropped into the shower. A prisoner named Donald DeLapp complained to one of the guards that his bed sheets were wet, and this was because of a pipe leak. When the guard came in to investigate, DeLapp quickly overpowered him. He grabbed his keys, and DeLapp gradually let other prisoners loose. Cells on each block were opened, and when this was done, they moved on to the next floor. The officers soon caught wind of this, but DeLapp let the guards know who was now in control.
Guards, they like the guards that told you, "This is riot time, don't you understand? You don't tell us nothing what to do."
In a strange twist of events, the prisoners were locking up the guards inside cells. Some prisoners had only a month or two left of their sentence left, so refused to come out. The rioters did not allow them to stay there, though.
The ones who are participating in the riot say, "You're going to come out, man. You're not going to stay in. This is for everybody this time."
A prison guard on death row named Clarence Dietzel threw his keys behind locked bars, which prevented the rioters from getting hold of them. However, the prisoners soon got hold of a sledgehammer, which allowed them to break into this section. Unlike many riots, there was not a list of demands made to make them stop. They simply seemed to be hell-bent on destruction and set fire to the place as state troopers and police officers entered the building. Sergeant Herb Bingham recalls, "The prisoners were right up to the gate and they were throwing chair legs and everything they could break up at us. As the authorities entered, they put prisoners back into cells, regardless of whether that was their cell or not. This would restore order in the prison." Trooper Corky Cundiff said, "It was just putting them in cells as you went along. There wasn't any argument about whether an inmate was assigned to a particular cell or not. You went in there anyway, and just getting them locked up, so there wasn't any running around the penitentiary." When order was restored and the roll call was carried out again, the names of 3 inmates had to be removed from any future lists as they were killed during these riots. What was meant to be a show of solidarity among the other inmates clearly was not the case for some. It's believed that these were alleged snitches, and some prisoners used this opportunity to get their revenge. 5. Lee Correctional Institution riots. On April 15, 2018, 2 rival gangs got into a feud at the Lee Correctional Institution. According to the New York Times, this was due to territory, money, and contraband. And by territory, I don't mean part of the prison. These people were so active in their gangs outside the prison that both parties decided to settle it inside these prison walls. The gangs feuding at the time are believed to be members of the Bloods, the Gangster Disciples, and the Crips. One inmate who witnessed these events said,
"It was chaos, and it was something I've never seen. I remember calling my wife and saying it's like a medieval battlefield."
When the brawl broke out, there were not enough prison officers around to break things up. In fact, the handful of officers on duty knew they wouldn't stand a chance. One of the units contained 250 inmates, but only 2 guards were on patrol, and they understandably did not fancy their chances. With no guards to calm things down, things escalated even further.
An hour and 15 minutes later, another fight broke out in 2 other dorms at Lee Correctional.
And with not enough officers, there was nothing they could do at that time.
Just so you know, there's about 250, 260 inmates in each dorm. We're not going to just send 1 or 2 officers in there.
The fact that this prison was situated in rural South Carolina meant that the SWAT team took a longer than usual time to arrive at the scene. One of the factors influencing riots was the existence of cell phones, which allowed the gangs to be in constant communication with one another. The prison considered even blocking cell phone signals from the entire prison, but realized that this could be a dangerous thing in times of emergency. Eventually, the SWAT team arrived, and dorm by dorm, they burst in and took back control. But by then, the damage had already been done. The U.S. witnessed its worst prison riot in 25 years.
In South Carolina, 7 inmates are dead and more than a dozen are wounded after a riot broke out inside a maximum security prison. An inmate who witnessed the incident said he saw bodies stacked up on each other and that correctional officers didn't do anything to stop the violence or help the injured.
The inmates had used this freedom to kill other inmates, and given that it took 7 hours to bring it under control, they were fortunate that there weren't even more casualties. 4. Lucasville prison riots. In 1993, tension was in the air at Lucasville prison in Ohio. The place was incredibly overcrowded. There were racial conflicts between inmates, and the new warden had placed restrictions on the movements of prisoners. The straw that broke the camel's back was when Muslim inmates were tested for tuberculosis with an injection containing alcohol, which is forbidden by their beliefs.
3:15, convicts returning from an exercise yard stage a fight, then jump corrections officers and seize control of cell block L.
An uprising took place with 3 incredibly strange bedfellows joining forces: the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Gangster Disciples, and the Black Muslims. On Easter Sunday, 400 inmates took over one of 3 of the main cell blocks. What unfolded next has haunted the area ever since. Retired Ohio Supreme Court Justice Paul E. Pfeiffer wrote, "The Lucasville riot was an altogether ugly affair, a public display of the worst humankind has to offer." In the early stage of the negotiations, the prisoners were not taken seriously. They threatened that they would kill one of the police officers held hostage if their demands were not met. Before they could come to any sort of agreement, one of the prisoners wanted to show them how far they were willing to go. Corrections officer Robert Vallandigham was strangled by other inmates. When he was no longer alive, they tossed his body into the recreation yard. 10 other inmates were killed, most of which were alleged to be snitches. Representatives from each of the gangster disciples, Black Muslims and Aryan Brotherhood, were meeting up to discuss their next move. To stop them in their tracks, the police turned off the electricity and water supply, which would, at the very least, make things more difficult.
You have to know that this is a maximum security institution. We have to maintain the security of the institution, and we'll listen to their demands, but our priority is to get our staff out.
The rioters made 21 demands that would force them to stop, and after 11 days, they agreed to these terms. Demand number 2 was, administrative discipline and criminal proceedings will be fairly and impartially administered without bias against individuals or groups. With the prison now under control, this part of the deal was breached. 5 prisoners, known as the Lucasville 5, were sentenced to death. Later on, Bomani Shakur was also sentenced to death because he was the leader of a certain group and had very little to do with the actual riot itself. According to the human rights lawyer and civil rights activist Staunton Lind, no sooner was the surrender negotiated with various prisoner spokespersons than the state of Ohio turned around and began to build death penalty cases against those very leaders and spokespersons. They didn't care who had really done things. They wanted to nail the leaders so that no prisoner would ever have this idea again. 3. Colorado State Penitentiary riots. In Colorado in 1929, one of the most bloody prison riots ever took place. Wall Street had just crashed and the Spanish flu was spreading. It was an incredibly intense time for America, and Colorado was no exception. At that time, Colorado State Penitentiary was full of underpaid and disloyal prison guards. The guards also had no systematic training or discipline in case of an emergency, and it was today when these inadequacies would be truly felt. That morning, Warden F.E. Crawford had just waved his son off to school and made his way to the penitentiary. At 8 a.m. he could see prisoners sweeping up leaves and carrying out basic duties. That very day, Jimmy Pardue and Danny Daniels set the wheels in action for their prison break. 4 guards were shot by Pardue. 3 of them died at the scene, while 1 died later in the hospital from his injuries. By holding 11 guards hostage in cell block 3 for almost 12 hours, the 2 started a riot. Daniels made Crawford listen to his requests for their release. Crawford nevertheless dispatched the National Guard. When Daniels saw his demands were not being granted, he started killing the captives one at a time. Throughout the night, the National Guard tried a variety of tricks to put an end to the violence. Even when Daniel and his fellow prisoners detonated the explosives, the wall outside cell block 3 did not collapse. The person who agreed to set off the bombs for the police was none other than a Catholic priest. The hero of the dynamiting attempts was a Catholic priest, Father Patrick O'Neill, who carried the bombs to the foot of the cell house wall under cover of machine gun fire from the prison walls. At around 4 a.m. on October 4th, as the police fired tear gas into the structure, Daniels, seeing no other way out of the predicament, shot Pardue and 2 other collaborators as hostages before turning the gun on himself. The New York Times described Daniels and Pardue as 2 desperate criminals possessed of reckless courage, determined to escape or die in the attempt. 2. The New Mexico State Penitentiary riot. In February 1980, some inmates were getting drunk with homemade alcohol, which was fermented in the prison kitchen and smuggled into the cells. As the alcohol touched their lips, they were reminded of better times outside these prison walls. They were now in a jail that had been rotting away since its construction in 1956. It had a capacity of 900 inmates, but that didn't stop the prison from cramming 1,157 inmates inside. As the beer kicked into their system, they became quite loud and angry, but eventually they had an idea, as the former inmate told Coat News.
Look, when they come to count. If they leave that door open, we're gonna jump them and take over this place.
As predicted, 3 corrections officers came to count and left the door open. So these inmates grabbed this opportunity with both hands, and it wasn't a case of tying them up and telling them to keep quiet. This was a level of torture you would expect from some of the state's deadliest criminals.
Well, they're leading him. He's on a belt like a leash, like a dog. He's on his knees, and they're kicking him.
These inmates quickly overpowered the prison guards and kept them as hostages. The prisoners took control of the maximum security section, and this was good news for some inmates, but bad news for others. Instead of being run by the wardens, this ward was run by prison gangs. Inmates were alleged to have been tortured, mutilated, and burnt alive. Others were killed over different grudges against the other inmates. All of the tensions between the other prisoners were getting very real.
You got people running around out here, stabbing people to see what it feels like to stab people. You got people stabbing dead bodies. I mean, it's nuts here.
When the police arrived, inmates who were not involved in the chaos were put in a difficult situation. They wondered, is surrendering to the police an admission of guilt? Or were they going to be nice to the prisoners who had just humiliated them across the country?
Therefore, but we just said, well, what can you do? I just couldn't bring myself to walk up there to the gate and saying I surrender. I mean, I was where I was supposed to be, and if they wanted their prison back, they could come get it anytime they wanted.
A surrender ultimately came. It took 36 hours for the violence to end, and it is estimated that 33 inmates were killed in total. The fact that they do not even have an exact figure will give you an idea of just how unorganized this prison was. Despite the high death count, this riot was not enough to make the top spot. Brace yourself for what's next. 1. Attica Prison Riot. At Attica Prison in Buffalo, New York, inmates were given 1 roll of toilet paper per month and 1 shower per week. If they requested more toilet paper, they were beaten by the guards. If they complained about this in any of their letters home, they were torn up and thrown in the thrash. This was something that the white inmates had to put up with, but for its black prisoners, things were much worse. One prisoner said, "It reminded me of the things I used to hear about on plantations in slavery. They treated us like we weren't human. Tension was bubbling up under the surface, and it was only a matter of time before the prisoners had enough." On the morning of September 9th, 1971, this prison would never be the same again. In the center of the prison was a place known as Times Square, which had a faulty gate. By breaking this gate, prisoners now had access to almost all of the prison. But more importantly, all of the prisoners in the jail could work in unison. With a riot underway, the prison's security was quick to fight back. Through tear gas and submachine guns, the prison managed to take control of 3 out of the 4 cell blocks, with only 1 cell block left to take back. 1281 prisoners now occupied an outside area known as the D Yard and managed to take 39 prison guards hostage. One guard, William Quinn, was thrown out of a 2nd-story building and died in hospital from injuries. He was the first casualty, but nowhere near the last. Prisoners agreed to free their hostages upon the following demands. They wanted better living conditions. They did not want the censorship of their mail, and they wanted expanded phone privileges. By September 13th, negotiations had reached their breaking point. State police and prison officers launched a raid on the area. A sea of bullets was cast across the yard, which killed 10 hostages and 29 inmates. 89 others were seriously injured. The police claimed that they had to act because the inmates were cutting the throats of the hostages.
Officials at the prison said 8 of the hostages had had their throats cut. But today, the Monroe County medical examiner, having looked at the bodies, said no throats were cut at all. The medical examiner says the hostages were apparently killed by large caliber ammunition and shotgun blasts from a distance, which immediately raised the possibility that some of the hostages may in fact have been shot down by the lawmen who broke in to rescue them.
So, in a cruel irony, filmmaker Stanley Nelson made a documentary about these riots in 2021, but was quick to note that the cruelty inflicted on prisoners is no longer ancient history. Conditions in prisons.
Wow, man, that was crazy, bro. Don't go to jail, don't go to prison, man. It get crazy in there. It's a whole nother world, man. It's like a whole nother galaxy in there, man. Different politics. Almost just like the streets. Basically like the streets without all the, you know, you moving around how you want to. Man, it's crazy, man. That was off the chain, man. I had to check that out. But the title, man, that's some clickbait, boy. Cops who went crazy and killed everybody in jail, bro. Come on, man. Y'all wild for that one, bro. I just be clicking, man. I don't look at them pre-look. They got me on that one, though. But y'all already know what time it is. Your boy Juice Baby. You're just making it do what it do. Thanks for watching. Y'all chilling with the kid, man. Make sure y'all hit them links. Got them vending machines. Y'all interested. The link in the end of the video. So y'all already know what time it is. I'll be right back at y'all boys. Peace.